I'm Michael Tobin, president of the Wellesley Conservation Land Trust. We're doing this event in partnership with the Wellesley Free Library and the Wellesley Natural Resources Commission. So we thank them for helping to get the word out and bringing you here. Good partners for that. Brief word on the Land Trust. Since 1958, we've been Wellesley's voice of conservation. Before there was a Natural Resources Commission, before there were wetlands laws in the state, we were protecting land in Wellesley. We have 10 sanctuaries currently, and we protect 3 other on private parcels. And I am proud to pre-announce that next month we'll be announcing 3 new initiatives to protect new open space in Wellesley. All that green space that you see as you drive around, much of it is not protected. And so one development at a time, it goes away. And so we'll be able to talk about 3 new ones that we're involved in, and there's still more in the works. So lots more coming. Our mission is to protect open space in Wellesley, to allow those sanctuaries to be open to the public for enjoyment and recreation and study, and then to educate youth and interest adults in matters of conservation. And so that's what this program and so many of our other programs are about. It's keeping you informed. Since 1964, I think it was, with the geological story of Wellesley, we now do walks to relive the history, 800 million year history of Wellesley. And we've done Zoom talks about it. And if with the holiday season, stocking stuffers, gifts, you may, if you don't have this or you know someone who doesn't have our book, Walks in Wellesley, you can buy it at Wellesley Books. We have a couple copies here for $20. But the quintessential 25 self-guided walks in Wellesley, with a fold-out map in the back, which I highly recommend. And so we are private, like the trustees of reservation, what they do for the state and Mass Audubon does for the state, we do for Wellesley. And we have Weston neighbors, we have Dover neighbors, and so forth. And so we protect Wellesley and the bordering lands. We're dependent upon you. And so we've just started our 2025 membership season. So look out for your emails or grab last year's newsletter. We'll be coming up with a 2025 newsletter here shortly. And so with that, thank you for coming, and let me turn it over to our Vice President, Judy Barr, who will give you some more information and announce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Well, again, thank you for being here. We became very nervous about attendance running against the spelling bee, which, as you know, is townwide. The select board has indicated they wanted to be here, but they are committed to being one of the teams in the spelling bee. So that's why that's computer is here and it's recording it so that we can share it with not only the select board who personally asked for it, which does our heart good, but also other people. If you need it, just go to the Wellesley Conservation Land Trust webpage, the info section, and say, send me the link and we'll send it. We'll probably also post it there. So that's one thing about future possibilities. But there's one that I want to share with you for next Tuesday night. That's via Zoom. It doesn't come down. Via Zoom. And it's a group called Wellesley Neighbors. It's also co-sponsored with the library. And it's about less heat, more light as the climate system become unpredictable. And the speaker is John Aberg, who is a leading climate scientist expert with over 200 scientific publications, a foundational textbook in the field. And he is a professor emeritus as well as past provost at the University of New Hampshire. So this will be at 7 o'clock next Tuesday night via Zoom. And there's several flyers that will be back there on the table over here, as well as we will post it on the Land Trust website. I think it'll be useful for all of us to hear that. So tonight, though, as part of our trying to identify issues within Wellesley, remember in the spring, we had the housing panel discussion about how to put housing and conservation together to inform some decisions that the town was facing. And tonight, in response to one of the issues at our town meeting, was a development that was on the banks of the Charles. Now, the Land Trust had already identified in June that Emily would be our speaker. Little did we realize that it would even be more important to hear her thoughts on some of the things affecting the Charles here in Wellesley. Emily Norton is the executive director of the Charles River Watershed Association. As the director, she oversees the staff of 18 scientists and advocates and focused on, there we go, thanks, focused on protecting and preserving the Charles River and its watershed. She previously served as the Massachusetts chapter director of the Sierra Club. She holds a bachelor's degree in philosophy from the University of Vermont, a master's degree in public policy from Harvard Kennedy School, and she for 10 years was a city councilor for the town of Newton. So she has broad experience in a number of these areas. We're so glad she could join us tonight and give us some insight about the state of the Charles River. Thank you.
All right. Judy, thank you so much. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Oh, is that better? All right, I'll sort of talk into it. Want to thank Judy so much for reaching out and all of you for having me here. Particularly want to thank those of you who are volunteer leaders with the Land Trust. I can speak from personal experience, having been an environmental advocate much of my life, that the volunteer leaders and volunteers in general really are the lifeblood of our nonprofits. So thank you, thank you, thank you, those of you who have stepped up to do this, and those of you who haven't, consider it. I bet the board would welcome more hands. I'm going to jump right into it. What I thought would be fun and interesting for us today would be to celebrate the success that we have made. How many people are from the area originally and remember when the Charles used to be not as pristine as it was? So I actually live in the house I grew up in Newton, and I'm older than I look. I make up for it by being immature. That's my claim. And so we have a lot to celebrate, and particularly with all of the challenges related to our environment in many ways, I think it's really important to celebrate, to remind the huge accomplishments that we have made related to the environment and protecting it. I'll get into a little bit of what the status is of the health of the river today, what those remaining threats are, and then I've got some Wellesley focus slides and points for you, and then next steps that hopefully you'll want to get involved with. I like to start out with a kudos to Wellesley. There are some really important things that you all are already leading on. You're leading on a lot of things, but particularly related to, I don't even know if you know this, but we are in the process of partnering with the town to update your wetlands bylaw to incorporate climate and make it more relevant and impactful today. So that process is ongoing, and I live in a city, not a town. I believe it would eventually have to go to a town meeting, so you're being alerted now. The Fuller Brook Restoration Project. Folks here, I assume, are familiar with that. This photo is from a tour that we've given. We've given several tours of this restoration project because it is a model for what we would like to see happen in other parts of the watershed. So kudos to you all for being such leaders in that. And then for your deep thinking in terms of how we balance conservation versus housing. I did watch much of your presentation from the other night. And as you can imagine, being a city councilor in Newton for 10 years, this is something that I did have some interaction with, but these are thorny issues, and you're not going to solve them if you're not at least talking about them and facing them head on. So really fabulous that you're doing that. Just some quick history about CRWA. We were founded in 1965. We're usually the oldest group around, but clearly not compared to this group. And when we were founded, it was prior to the passage of the Clean Water Act. So we got a lot more leverage to hold polluters accountable and make progress once that was passed. Our mission then and remains to protect, restore, and enhance the Charles River and its watershed through science, advocacy, and the law. And then sometimes people are wondering, where do you get your money? We get our money mostly from individuals and foundations. We get some government money, very little, and then some money from corporate America. But really, it's regular people who step up and make our work possible. And then just because of where we are right now, I would like to just start out by saying CRWA has persevered and been successful and impactful through all kinds of presidential administrations. 11, starting with LBJ. So we are just going to do what we are doing, what we have always done, and I'm quite confident that we are going to continue to be successful. And I'd be happy to take questions about that or comment more in the Q&A if that would be useful. We have 5 bucket areas of our work. River science. I don't know if we have any volunteer monthly monitors here, but we have folks who go out at 6 o'clock in the morning once a month collecting water quality, collecting samples that we can use to assess the quality of the river. When I started, I was like, I asked the staff and the board, why is a little nonprofit doing that? Shouldn't the government be doing that? Well, maybe they should, but they weren't. And they wouldn't if we weren't doing that. So river science, very important. Science leads all of our work, river restoration, dam removal, invasives removal, very site-specific restoration work, climate resilience, keeping us safe from climate change, stormwater solutions, how we manage our stormwater, and then outreach and education. If we don't get out in the community, it's as if we're not even doing the work. So we'll take a little trip through memory lane, which never gets old. The Industrial Revolution arguably began on the Charles River. This is Waltham. And by 1875, there were 43 mills between Watertown Dam and the Boston Harbor. Imagine all of that pollution. Well, you don't have to imagine it. This report in 1875 said, don't even bother trying to clean up the river. It is beyond hope from Natick to Boston. Just give it up, not gonna happen. This was an article in Harper's Magazine about Hell's Half Acre in Cambridge, where the author wrote about the Charles River. By the time the Charles River reaches Cambridge, it is foul and noisome, polluted by offal and industrial wastes, scummy with oil, unlikely to be mistaken for water. Paints quite a picture, doesn't it? This is from a 1870s Boston Board of Health report describing Boston in the summers. An atmosphere of stench so strong as to arouse the sleeping, terrify the weak, and nauseate and exasperate nearly everybody. That is what we came back from. These are a couple photos. Picture paints a thousand words, million words. I can't remember how many words. On the left, you have, this was the Milford Town dump. That's what they thought. This is a beautiful park today. On the right, you have the Medway Dye Company, literally turning the river pink. And then a little closer to home, I don't know exactly, maybe some of you recognize this particular location. This is in Wellesley near South Natick. And we all remember, or well, those of us my age and older, remember the Standell song, Dirty Water. Our river was so dirty that it was central to our identity as a city that we had a polluted river. This graphic shows the amount of sewage that was going into the Charles River in 1988, 1.7 billion gallons of sewage-laden wastewater. This teeny tiny little box on the left shows it was down to 30 million gallons, still not nothing by 2017. And then this is a little foreshadowing. 2023, it was up to 72 million gallons. So I won't go into the whole history of the cleanup, but just to say, it really was seemingly miraculous. And what a difference that has made going. This is a beautiful shot of the river in Boston. The Esplanade is a magical place for all of us. The river is teeming with life again, which was not the case for decades. Arguably, the cleanup of the Charles and the harbor has transformed the quality of life in all of Greater Boston, right? So this work is really central to all of us. And I know that because we surveyed people. We asked our friends and supporters to tell us what does the Charles mean to you? And we got so many just almost, I would say, emotional stories about why the river means so much to people, important things that happened to them at the river, first kiss, whatever, visiting the river when someone in memory of someone. Like, the river is very, very important for our community. And I also like to, go a little, continue with the emotional side. If you read about or learn about the indigenous perspective toward nature and the rivers, and this is a quote from a book called Water Will Win. Many indigenous traditions don't consider water to be a commodity, but a who. Many indigenous people not only believe that water is alive, but that it's kin. You protect it the way that you would protect your grandmother, your mother, your sister, your aunties. And this photo is Hartman Dietz, who's a member of the Mashpee Wampanoag, who we work closely with as our indigenous consultant. And so we within CRWA, whether it's the staff or the volunteers, I like to think that we are doing work that would exemplify, well, how would we treat the river if the river was a member of our family? Another example in that vein I'll give is Supreme Court Justice William Douglas argued on a case. He was on the losing side of a case in the 1970s where Sierra Club was trying to prevent a ski resort in California. And he argued the river as plaintiff speaks for the ecological unit of life that is part of it. It was this sort of the rights of nature movement that you've probably heard a bit about. And so I like to think that within CRWA, we take these perspectives. It starts to get, and just be forewarned, it gets a little sciencey and engineering, but it's really how we manifest these more emotional connections to the river. So I'll start with, anyone define a watershed? Anyone want to shout it out? What is a watershed? There's 28 of them in Massachusetts.
It's the area of land that drains into a body of water.
Perfect. When it rains, whatever body of water that rain or that snow melt ends up in, that's your watershed. So there's 28 in Massachusetts. Our watershed runs north. It starts in Hopkinton, like the marathon. Luckily for the runners, they don't have to run the 80 miles of the river. There are 19 dams on the main stem, about 300 square miles. It encompasses 35 cities and towns, although because municipal boundaries don't follow watershed boundaries, we do share some communities with other watersheds. We have about 1 million residents, and over 60% of our residents live in environmental justice communities, which is higher than the state average of 50%, so something to keep in mind. Our watershed is on the traditional lands of the Massachusetts, the Nipmuc, and the Wampanoag peoples, and we recognize them as the past, present, and future stewards of the land. And now I'm going to get into how clean the Charles is. I don't know if anyone follows our report cards. We do a grade on the river every year. People might remember a governor jumping into the river in 1995. Anyone remember that? What governor was it?
Well,
Governor Weld. The river got a D that year. So as you can see, and he still jumped in, although he was quoted in the Globe later as saying he had a earache for 3 weeks. So as you can see, we grade all of the river. That's new. We used to only grade the lower basin. And as you can see, the grades vary widely. B's in the upper reaches, basically Hopkinton to Medfield, and then A minus. This is from 2023 data. B plus from Medfield to Waltham, and then B minus from Waltham to Boston. And then the Muddy River is always the dirtiest tributary that we measure, this year getting a C. What this tells you is that wherever you have more impervious cover, more pavement, that's where you have more polluted water. And that's because of stormwater. When the rain hits the paved surface, carries it into the storm drain, straight into the river, no treatment. And what does that mean? So a B minus between Waltham and Boston, it's not that it's never clean enough to swim, it's more like 50 to 75% of the time, which is really not frequent enough to open up the area, that part of the river for swimming. So I'm going to go through 4 threats. You ready? Number 1, sewage. How many people knew there was still raw sewage going into the Charles River on a regular basis in 2024? All of these little poop drops. So I'm a mother of 3 boys. My oldest is 21. I've been talking about poop for 21 years. This is a perfect job for me. I get to keep talking about poop. These locations along the Charles in Cambridge and Boston are where you still have what's called combined sewer overflows. We still have sewage going into the river after big storms, which I'll talk about. We warn people.
So there's no raw sewage going in upstream?
Not where you are. And I could zip through this if none of you care, because it's not here. Sometimes there are some folks. Do I have anyone who rows in Cambridge or Boston? No rowers? Okay, so you all don't care at all. I will just zip right through this. If you did want to start rowing, we warn people about whether it's safe. Here's a few things that are in poopy water. Take my word for it, it's bad. Okay, threat number 2, a little closer to home. Stormwater. As I said, whatever is on that paved surface, your gasoline, your oil, your pet waste, sand, salt, etc., straight into the storm drain, straight into the river, causing the growth of invasive species, which crowd out native species, causing the growth of cyanobacteria, which you've probably been hearing about happening more often. And so stormwater pollution is really dangerous for the river. Threat number 3, dams. We still have 19 dams on the main stem of the river and dozens more on tributaries, including 3 between Newton and Wellesley. So folks familiar with those dams? Sometimes people aren't even aware that there are still all these dams on the river. I will confess to you that until I took this job, I was not as aware. Why are dams bad? Because a lot of times people don't think that they are bad. If a dam's been there a long time, well, isn't it good for the river if it's been there a long time? So the one that has been on the Charles the longest, the Watertown Dam, was built, in the early 1600s. So, okay, 400 years, sounds like a long time. The river has been there 10,000, 12,000 years. So anything that evolved with the river did not evolve with a dam. So dams block fish passage, they slow the water down, they heat it up, they block sediment. These are all things that are bad for the native ecology of the river. And they're also increasingly dangerous to those who live downstream from them. We'll get into that a little bit. Threat number 4, climate change. Probably don't need to tell you about how bad climate change is, bad for people, bad for rivers. One of the impacts is drought. We did not have any major drought since the 1960s. Then we had drought in 2016, 2020, 2021, 2022. And as I'm sure you all know, because you're in their conservation limits now, 2024, we're breathing smoke from fires across Massachusetts. Bad for agriculture, bad for rivers, bad for fish. Yeah, it's very bad. Okay, next up, heat. When I was a kid, schools, homes, it wasn't natural that they all had air conditioning, right? Now you can't imagine building a new home or a school or a commercial building without air conditioning because our summers are so much hotter, as are our winters. My kids ask, when are we going to have a white Christmas again? And it's unfortunate. Even in my own kids' lifetime, they've seen the difference in the lack of snow. And then flooding. This is from the Wellesley Police Twitter account. You might remember when this happened, flooding out Route 9. Your own municipal vulnerability preparedness report talked about the risks to Wellesley from flooding around Morse's Pond, along the banks of the river, throughout town in various areas, and also apparently your high school is in a floodplain. So I don't know if you knew that. So that is a big risk. All right, so what do we do about all these things? All right, we had the four risks or threats. I'm still going to tell you about the sewage because hopefully you'll be interested anyway. We very subtly call it our Cut the Crap campaign. And this is literally a sign in Cambridge that shows you where, actually it's on the Boston side, shows you where an outfall is. Why? Why would we still be putting sewage into the Charles River that we all love? At the time that stormwater pipes were built, it was really an advance over chamber pots and outhouses. But what they did at the time was they had one pipe for your stormwater and for your household sewage. Okay, and it all went straight into the river, thus leading to that quote about how Boston smelled in the summers. So the problem here is, so when it's dry weather, there's no problem, right? You've got your stormwater, there is no stormwater, and your household wastewater goes into the combined pipe, goes all the way to the Deer Island. The problem is when you have big rainstorms. And then as you can see, the stormwater plus the household water overwhelms the capacity of the pipe. And if we did not release it into the river, we would have sewage backups in people's homes, in the streets, et cetera, which is obviously unacceptable. In contrast, newer cities, like you don't see CSOs in California, for example, they never built their systems that way. They always had a separate storm sewer for the river and a separate sewage system for your wastewater treatment plant. So, all right, this is it. This is the big, you ready for your mind to be exploded? Where we've made big progress on sewage reduction, we've done a lot of sewer separation. Where we haven't done it is in the more dense areas of Cambridge or Boston, where they might be under buildings or in very complicated, expensive areas. So instead, what we could be doing is green stormwater infrastructure. So the green there, what that signifies is anytime you can capture the water from the rain and direct it into the ground rather than into the storm drain, you are not overwhelming your system. It can be much cheaper to do that. And particularly when you look at what these solutions are, rain gardens, bioswales, green roofs, it's more nature in your urban environment. So it's super cool. It is still very new though. People who went to DPW school, I don't know there is DPW school, but just go with me, 30 years ago, this is not what they were taught to do. So even today, we are not making these types of investments as we redo a street, redo a sidewalk, have a development. We are not putting these kind of investments in. So that is part of our work, is education advocacy. Threat number 2, stormwater runoff. Little challenging because the source is virtually every paved surface in the entire watershed. So what do we do about that? All right, prepare again for your mind to be blown. What this shows is what happens under a natural system and under a heavily built system. When it's nature, half of the water from your rain, your snow melt, whatever, ends up in the ground. 10% stays on the surface as runoff, and the rest going back into the atmosphere. In contrast, when you have a heavily built environment, an urban area, very little, because it's paved, goes into the ground. Most of it becomes runoff. That right there is your water quality. That right there is your flooding. So this, if you remember nothing else from what I say, although I'm sure you're going to remember all of it, just keep this in mind in terms of what the mindset we need to do if we're going to be solving things. What this graph shows is how long it takes for water to dissipate in a paved surface, that's the red, versus a natural cover, the blue. It's not that the water doesn't infiltrate into the ground eventually or into the system eventually. It's just that by the time that happens, your car is flooded out, your building is flooded out, the roads are flooded out, and it can be very dangerous. You probably remember a few years ago, people drowning in basement apartments in New York City because the water came so fast. What this shows is the amount of impervious cover, so basically pavement, buildings, tennis courts, etc., in each of our communities, and the arrow points to Wellesley. So you're not Somerville, which apparently barely has a tree, and you're not Sherburne, which barely has a road. And you start to see water quality problems at the 10 to 25%, which is where you are. And as the slide shows, even each just 1% increase in impervious cover can be increasing your flood risk by 3 or more percent. So as you develop more, and you're going to hear a theme here, as Wellesley develops more, you're going to want to be thinking about this. It's fine to develop, but you want to do it in a certain way, not the way we've been doing it. And again, here are some photos of what green infrastructure looks like. It's not that you can't have a sidewalk, it's that it's designed to direct water into native plantings and certain soils rather than the storm drain. This middle one is a marijuana dispensary in Newton. And again, another example of a sidewalk where it's been designed for the water to go into the ground. And it's cool, it's bringing nature into our built environment. Threat number 3, dams. So some of you live downstream of the Natick Dam, and you might be curious about that, so I will be talking about that. But I just want to give you just examples of dam removal projects that we are prioritizing. As you may know, the Natick Select Board voted 4-1 to remove the Natick Dam. That's a photo on the left. This is a rendering that they commissioned on the right. So we are very excited about that. Another one that we are working on is the Watertown Dam. Again, the photo on the left, the rendering on the right, still beautiful. What we have, we try to, and I know Natick has been doing a great job of this, and we've been working with the state to do this in Watertown because the state owns the Watertown Dam. Folks there like how it looks. They like how it sounds. So put in some rocks so there can be some riffles. Make sure that you don't like the invasive plants. Well, we don't either. We will get rid of those as we restore the area. So really try to listen to what people want. And then in terms of climate change, more water is coming. I'm sure this crowd, I don't need to, tell you about that, but basically the top slides show the growth and the amount of water in the top 1% of storms since 1958. As you can see, especially the most recent one, 1958 to 2016, our part of the country has seen the most growth. The bottom two graphics show the future. The bottom left is the low emission future. The bottom right is the high emission future. The darker the blue, the more the water. So as you can see, we're really, the way things are now are not the way they're going to stay. So we need to be ahead of it. So this gets to why I didn't plan to have 2 jobs and 3 children as a single mom, but it worked out very well. Having been a city councilor, I can tell you, who's making land use decisions in Massachusetts? It's often your local elected officials, which, and I will say this, even if they were here in person rather than watching the tape, should terrify all of us. We have a very strong home rule culture here where communities like to make their own decisions. We don't have regional government, even though water does not respect municipal boundaries. All but Cambridge and Boston have part-time, many are unpaid elected officials. So when I was a city councilor, I had no one I could say, hey, this stuff is kind of sciencey, and I was a philosophy major. I don't really understand. Can someone write something up for me? I didn't have that. And your staff don't either. Your town administrator doesn't have the time to be doing white papers for your select board. So the more you all are knowledgeable and can be helping them understand this stuff, the better. And I can tell you from experience, when things are highly technical, sciencey, engineering, delete. I mean, I'm no disparaging my fellow elected officials, but it's just human nature. So again, we really need to be breaking this down for people in a way that they sense the urgency. And then of course, the most affected have the least amount of political power anyway. So these are all things that make it why I felt it was so important for CRWA to step up and be doing even more. So we've got a 3-legged stool to help protect you and the other people in the Charles River Watershed. The first one is we do climate resilience 101 trainings for local elected officials. We go to each community that'll have us, we walk them through these slides, and we help them with things that they can do. So here's just some examples. We did this in Wellesley a couple of years ago. What are we talking about? We're talking about wetlands bylaw. We all are already making progress on tree protection, stormwater utility, green stormwater infrastructure, like I've been talking about. And then we help them get funding if they want to be doing projects. Second leg of the stool is we work with your municipal staff. So this photo, it's called the Charles River Climate Compact. Even though what happens upstream of you and what you do affects people downstream, if you don't have people even know each other and talk to each other, well, you're going to be making decisions that aren't so good for each other. So this photo is of the first meeting of our climate compact. This is municipal staff. And I can't speak in detail about how Wellesley does, but in a lot of our smaller communities, your planning director is your town council, is your sustainability director. These people are overwhelmed. This first meeting was half information sharing and half therapy. Like really, there are wonderful people who work at the local level. They need more help and support if they're going to be doing the work that it takes to protect the river and to protect all of you. And then the third leg is a flood model. I don't know if people are aware of this, but our development decisions at this point are basically are based on FEMA flood maps. FEMA flood maps, I cannot emphasize this enough, are decades out of date. They are not getting updated because we have spoken with FEMA very clearly. They are not getting, and they were never designed to help make development decisions. They're designed to set flood insurance rates. So we do not have data. You all are making decisions here in Wellesley about development without data, and that is very dangerous. So we worked with our city, with the 20+ cities and towns who are in the Climate Compact to get a state grant. So kudos to the Baker administration, now the Healy administration, to hire Weston and Sampson to build a flood model. And basically what it shows is and anyone can use it, it's interactive. You can put in a size storm, a 2-year storm, 10-year storm, 100-year storm, and you can put in today, 2030 to 2050, or 2070, and it spits out where the flood risks are. So I just, for fun, pulled a couple maps of Wellesley. So hopefully, so you can see that's, if you can't see from far away, that's the high school right there. It's the same location. This is a 100-year storm, an actual 100-year storm, not a FEMA one, today. And this is a 100-year storm in 2070. And it might be hard to see, but I'll be happy to share the slides later. Or like I said, you can go and check out the map yourself. Over time, there's going to be more flooding, and there's going to be more flooding close to where there are buildings. So that's what the idea of the map is that it can be a resource for better decision making. We also, in addition to modeling storms, we modeled various scenarios. So I don't know if people knew how important stormwater rules are. Maybe none of you have ever thought about stormwater rules before. Like I said, I certainly hadn't before I took this job. It's really, really important for your health, for your safety, and for your property. So we modeled the quote unquote Watertown rule. Watertown requires on new development that you have to hold enough water from a 100-year storm. That's a pretty big storm, 8 inches of water over 24 hours. That's far and away beyond what any other community in Massachusetts is doing. So we modeled that. We modeled looking at reducing impervious cover or doing more storage. And land trusts, you're doing storage when you're conserving land. So I want to give you a shout out for that. And then we looked at scenario 3, which was, I think, the top 2. I can't even remember. My much smarter staff actually run this work. And what that spit out was that, okay, on the very left, baseline, no action. If we do nothing, how much flooding will there be? This total runoff in a 2-year storm. The dark blue, the second one, that's how much runoff there would be if we don't take any action by 2070. Short version, a lot more flooding all over the watershed in those areas that the map generates. But look what happens if all we do is have our cities and towns implement what Watertown is already doing. There would be less flooding than we are experiencing today. So this is really important. None of you are advocating for it. No one is advocating for it in any other cities and towns because this is still so new and not understood. But that's why anytime I can be invited to speak to a group like you, I want to talk about the Watertown rule. I want everyone thinking and obsessed with how Watertown manages their stormwater. And the same thing in a 10-year storm. Again, the no action dark blue is really bad by 2070. And the Watertown rule would at least keep us for a 10-year storm no worse than we are today. And the other scenarios are not as good. So keep that in mind. Now, want to bring it home to Wellesley. Has anyone been coming to the CRWA and town webinars or meetings about the Longfellow Pond project? Okay, so this was generated from that climate compact work. We talked to your town folks, and we have a project here where we worked with Brandon Schmidt, whom some of you might know, who is a superstar. And we looked at the Longfellow Pond in the town forest to identify flood storage solutions. And this site currently floods at Oakland Street and Route 9, causes some backyard flooding. And what we would be doing here is some flood storage, some improving culverts, implementing some green stormwater infrastructure, and this will improve flooding. All we're doing at this point is getting the designs together. It will take funding to implement, but the more people who know about it and support this idea, because you want to see less flooding, the better. So that's just an example of the kind of thing that we're doing in your community to help protect you and protect the river. Just another couple Wellesley focus things. We're also doing a tree canopy project where we're doing a plan for tree protection in the entire watershed. What we found in terms of how much tree cover there is in Wellesley, you're about the average, really close to that 53%. As you can see, Somerville, no trees. Dover, lots of trees. But this is the one to really pay attention to. This is how much tree canopy loss there has been between 2008 and 2021. Again, Wellesley is about the average of 6.9%. Something to keep in mind as you do more development. It's not to say that you can't do development and you shouldn't, but you don't want to do it in such a way that you're continuing to lose tree canopy. And then I'll get into the dams. So folks are probably familiar with the Cordingley Dam. That at this point, there is no effort to remove these dams. We would love to, but we do things as we have resources. There is a fish ladder that's not really working very well. This is considered a significant hazard, meaning if it were to breach, there's a lot downstream that would be harmed, and it's in fair condition, which is not great. It's not as bad as it could be. And nothing's really happening with it. The Finlay Dam, very close by, does have a fish ladder. Again, it's also a significant hazard. This one is in poor condition, which is worse than fair. I personally was shocked. We actually did a public records request to find out the status of the DCR owned dams, including these two. And I was still a city councilor at the time, and this is Lower Falls, which wasn't my ward, but I'm friends with the city councilors there. I was like, so do you guys know this? No idea. So I reached out to the city engineer for Newton. I said, what are we doing? We have a poor condition dam that if it reaches, we're in trouble. He wasn't even aware. So DCR owns dams in our communities, inspects them, does not share the results with the community, and it's in poor condition. And the storms are getting bigger. Like, this is really bad. This is not your government protecting you. And then the circular dam, you're probably familiar with this one at Hemlock Gorge. No fish ladder at all there. I know it's very beautiful, but it's also considered a significant hazard. And this one is considered satisfactory condition. So anyway, just wanted to let you know about the dams that are close to you. In terms of the risk to Wellesley residents from the Natick Dam, this is from a report that was done in 2012, and Natick, to their credit, has done a lot of analysis. So there's a lot more on their website that you could look into, but I just wanted you to know that this report uses the word remote in terms of risks to Wellesley, but they did also include the addresses in Wellesley that are downstream and would be affected. So I do personally think, while it's better for the river and I have a vested interest here, I think it's better for you all that the dam be removed. I'm almost done. In terms of next steps, I know that you have a new development that's been proposed. You had a discussion about it. I actually went to the site and toured it. This is a photo there. It looks to me, just from, we haven't done a full analysis or anything, but if I were you all, I would encourage you to maximize benefits to the river, restoration of the river. As well, it looks like an incredible opportunity for river access. And I know we have Herb Nolan here from Solomon Foundation, and that is what they focus on. But if you haven't been to this site, Herb, you probably have, because you know the whole watershed, but really looks like an incredible opportunity there. The Longfellow Pond project, we'd love support for that. The wetlands ordinance, you might consider updating your stormwater bylaw. You might consider updating your tree protection bylaw, especially as you're developing more. And in that way, you can have more development while managing your conservation goals, and then dam removal in those, if you were to get passionate about that. I'd also like to just call out, there's work we're doing at the state and region level in order to, again, protect you in ways that you're not being protected right now. I don't think it's reasonable that a small nonprofit is the one protecting you all from flooding right now. This really is the role of government. We should be providing these maps to watershed regions across the state, and ideally there would be a governance solution, just like with the Boston Harbor, there needed to be the creation of the MWRA. So right now there is not government acting to protect you from flooding, whether it's a local level, state level, regional level, and that is a real gap that I would say our governance, our policy has not caught up to the science of climate change. Right now, Massachusetts is one of only 14 states, the only one in New England, that when you go to buy or rent a home, there's no requirement that someone tell you if the home had flooded out ever. It's not a requirement here. So you could be putting yourself at risk, putting your property at risk. So that's something we're advocating for. Our watershed map should be something that is available to everyone in the state. And then as you develop more, or anyone does, we should be restricting development away from flood zones. The MBTA communities law, which I'm sure you're familiar with, in terms of the guidance, it says that a community may restrict development away from flood zones, not shall. I think that's irresponsible. The other side of that, though, is that there's going to be areas that are not at risk of flooding that need to see more housing and more density. So that is just something I'd like to, for you all to consider. And then my last success story, has anyone ever heard of the Charles River Natural Valley Storage Area? Yes, of course, we got some flooding nerds in the crowd. I found this a bit fascinating. I grew up in Newton, like I said, live in the House of Gerben, had never heard of this. So there were two massive hurricanes in the 1950s, Connie and Diane. They retired the names, first billion-dollar hurricanes, decimated the eastern seaboard, including the Charles River Watershed. And the Army Corps came in, they were going to build another dam, more levees, spend $100 million. And instead, my predecessor by two, a woman named Rita Barron, took an Army colonel on a boat ride to the upper reaches of the Charles and pointed out all of this natural area that was still there, acting as flood storage, and said, protect these areas now so that in future storms, it's protecting lower communities. And so you can drive around, there's 16 communities that have land that the Army Corps owns. Basically, instead of 100 million, they spent 8 million buying up land in these 16 communities. And you'll see these signs and you don't know what it means. And I'm telling you, that's what it means. You are looking at a flood storage project that has been keeping you safe or safer ever since, and you've never heard of it. This is the mindset that we need to incorporate if we're going to really protect people from climate change going forward. That's all I got. So happy to take questions or criticisms. I was a city councilor, I'm used to that.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the Watertown rule?
Yeah, so basically, when you develop a property or redevelop a property, there's all kinds of rules related to that, including how you have to manage stormwater. So in Newton, you have to keep the first 2 inches of a storm on site. Well, that's not going to do much when a 100-year storm is 8 inches. 100-year storm is 8 inches now. And that's going to be growing. That'll be 11 inches over time. So what they're doing in Watertown is they're telling anyone who's doing a development, you have to put in, whether it's underground chambers, rain gardens, whatever those solutions are, you have to hold enough, you have to hold 8 inches of a storm over 24 hours. That water has to stay on site, not go into the storm drain. So as you can imagine, there's going to be costs related to that, as there always are when you make anyone do anything. And so that's why the more people are advocating for something, then your elected officials would feel comfortable maybe telling the developer, I get that there might be a cost, but this is about protecting the whole community. And particularly when you look at these updated maps, you know, this area is really at risk. So that's what that's about.
What's the impediment to getting dams removed?
The impediment, I'd say, is inertia. We're so used to them. Sometimes we get very attached to them. And you may be aware that Massachusetts is not a leader when it comes to maintaining a lot of our infrastructure, even the infrastructure that we're more familiar with, like our roads and bridges. Dams are just this weirdly forgotten infrastructure. So, but I can tell you from experience that when you take the time to educate people, engage people, listen to them, then there's often support for removal. Now, sometimes it's even more complicated in that you might have, and this is what's happening in Grantham, you have a few people that are around a pond that's created from a dam. And so it will really impact their recreation. But 5 or 6 homes recreational benefits versus the safety risk of folks downstream. That's I think what that's about. And then in Natick, I think the big driver was the financial aspect, that they owned the dam, so they would have to pay to repair it, maintain it, and as part of improving it, they would have had to cut down all the trees that are across the river from where the bench is, and it would have significantly changed the enjoyment that people had. So I think the finances, the aesthetics, and I like to think the ecological benefit was impactful there.
Why was that? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. The shout
I
out
was going to ask why that dam in Natick was created to begin with. Why?
for recreation.
Recreation.
Yeah.
So if a dam breaches in like a heavy rainstorm, then there's a flood down.
It's an explosion of water. If we're going to remove them, we'd much rather do it in a planned way. And I don't want to be scaring anyone at all. But more water's coming. And so I think there's this, I think we all fall into a mindset of like, oh, this is the way things are. I don't really think about the way they're gonna be, particularly when it's super sciencey and I have other things going on in my life to think about. Let's get ahead of this. We know they're unsafe. We know they're bad for the river. Let's get ahead of it.
We were given new taxes of some sort for wastewater diversion. And I wondered if you could speak to that. Who started that and where was the motive of that?
So is it a stormwater fee?
Stormwater.
Yeah.
Stormwater.
That's great, and that's on me because I didn't do my homework too. I would have added that to your shout out for you. The idea there is that if you don't have a separate dedicated fund for stormwater improvements, then stormwater is competing with police, fire, schools, parks. So you really want to have a separate fee. The other nice thing about it is you can charge your nonprofits. So, when you have, say, Wellesley College can pay a stormwater fee, whereas, there's other, property taxes and so forth that they don't have to pay for. So it's really important that there's a dedicated fund to make these investments that we're talking about.
Wellesley implemented that this year.
That's great. Well, another kudos for you.
So it is local. It's
That
not
is just for
statewide.
Wellesley. So that is actually part of our advocacy, is encouraging cities and towns to do what you all have done.
Is there a qualification for tree canopy? Because we do have a tree removal sort of about removing trees. The difference between how much one mature, like 50-year-old tree is going to drink is a lot different from the token trees that are planted after the big one is cut down. Is there quantifiers to speak to that?
Yes, and I would encourage you to check out, or I could send you our first webinar on this, because we're in the process of putting together a restoration plan with funding that we secured from Representative Catherine Clark. So really grateful to her for that. And you're absolutely right. The mature trees, when it comes to carbon sequestration, because it's kind of interesting, trees are sort of a climate mitigation and a climate resilience investment as well. Your mature trees are so much better at cooling the air, cleaning the air, sequestering carbon, storing stormwater. But often our rules are, oh, you can cut down this, 20-inch DBH tree as long as you replace the caliper inches. That has been Newton's rule. And you don't see the same benefits for decades. Having said that, when it's a tree on private property, it's complicated. There's a sense we like to be able to do what we want to do on our own property, even though you cutting down that mature tree on your property adds to my air quality reduction, adds to me having to run my AC more. I mean, you really are affecting the health of the whole community. So when I was a city councilor, I worked on updating our tree ordinance, and it was battle. And we didn't end up where I wanted, but we did make progress. So I think if that's something that the community is interested in, having said that, I mean, obviously, as you saw from that, Wellesley is very tree covered. But I would just say it's something to keep an eye on as you do more development.
I can add to that, Emily. Many people believe the Wellesley tree canopy law is bylaw is very weak. It's easy to cut down a tree, pay a small fine, and move on. Wellesley Conservation Land Trust is pleased that we led and set state precedents in the state of Massachusetts. If there's a conservation restriction on private property, and the owner of that property cuts down trees, damages the land beyond what is allowed within the conservation restriction, not only do they have to remediate with those immature trees, they are responsible for paying a damage fee, a penalty for doing that. And so Massachusetts, up until 2021, did not have this precedence, and now we do. So conservation land trusts all over the state, including the trustees, are now using this to keep landowners with conservation restrictions.
That's fabulous. Another couple things that Newton did, even if we tried to have all trees of 6 inches or more be affected, that a homeowner couldn't just willy-nilly cut them down. We're not successful in that. I think it starts at like 24 inches. But everyone has to get a tree removal permit, even if you're not going to have to pay a fine. just as a way to have an interaction with the resident, because sometimes even just a conversation, oh, you want to, expand your deck. Well, what if you did it in this way? Sometimes there's a chance to save trees that way when you have a chance to have an interaction. There's also a butter notification now, which there wasn't before, and you have a chance to have a neighbor have a conversation, or at least a neighbor can make sure that whatever their neighbor does doesn't harm their own trees. So it was baby steps, but yeah, all of these steps help. And it's not like anyone's a good guy or a bad guy. A lot of it is really the mindset. If you think trees are like overgrown weeds, well, of course, who cares if you cut them down? But if you think of them as vital health-related infrastructure, well, you might not be so cavalier about cutting them down. So I think as we have a chance to help people understand that, it used to be not that uncommon, not that I ever did this, but dumping motor oil down the, storm drain, changing your own oil, burning leaves. I mean, there's things that I'm sure they happen somewhere, but recycling, like that was a huge behavioral change. So we really can update our mindsets on these things.
Are we using salt on our roads much, and how bad a problem is salt pollution in the watershed?
So we have a chloride monitoring program, and salt is bad for the river. That is like one of many things. It's a trade-off because, and I've certainly spoken with the folks at DPW in Newton and elsewhere, sometimes residents want to see a very dry, clear road. And of course, we don't want anyone to be at risk. I can't speak to what Wellesley is doing. I know that Newton started laying down brine rather than full-on salt first. I think there's also beet juice is something that people have been using. So I know that there's ways that they're innovating, but that is absolutely an issue. Our old office was at the Leo J. Martin Golf Course in Weston. And to see that DCR parking lot in the winter with, I mean, you could go sledding in the salt that was in the parking lot. It made me crazy. I'm like, this is the state. So it's definitely, we have work to do there. It was oh yes. Betsy,
Hi.
hello.
I was wondering if you have worked at all about improving on impervious surfaces. I know that it's I have a client in Somerville, and they were talking about when they did a renovation, they had to remove some of their pavement because Somerville has actual, I don't know, laws about how much of the property can be essentially paved or have roof or. So is that something you worked on at all?
So that is definitely one of the solutions that Betsy asked about, she's a Newton person, about Somerville having incentives or rules related to depaving. And that was one of the solutions that we modeled. And that is something that we would love to see more of and love to see incentives around. I can't speak to what the policy is there and why that was happening there. I believe that is something that's written into many of the stormwater utility rules, that you can pay less of your stormwater utility if you remove some, because often the charge is related to your acreage or your square footage of impervious cover. But yeah, if you do remove pavement, whether your driveway or whatever, why not see a benefit to that and how much you're paying if you're paying based on how much impervious cover? Anything we can be doing to be incentivizing these actions is good.
What about the trade-offs between the trees and the solar energy? Because we looked into that and I just refused to cut down a tree, and I'm glad to know it was right.
Yeah, that's a really tough one. We need more solar, but we also need trees. There was a big battle in Newton when we redid our library parking lot. There were folks who, all environmentalists, very passionate, but some of us favored putting solar panels over the parking lot, even though it entailed removing some of the trees that were in the parking lot, and others did not want to because it was tree removal. I personally do think it would be good to max out the rooftops, the parking lots, etc., rather than going for the virgin forest in Western Mass, which there's a lot of that happening there. So I know that the state has a working group because I was serving on it when I was at the Sierra Club. So I don't know where that stands now, but I believe they are trying to find that balance. But I would say communities like Wellesley and Newton, I think we should be more willing to think about the rooftop and the parking lots. Even sometimes people don't like the aesthetics and so forth. When you look at how much clean energy we do need to be generating.
If I could add to that, Mass Audubon, last year, I believe, came out with a very big study and white papers about exactly this trade-off. And so the Mass Audubon is now out advocating, do not cut down your woods or in virgin forests for solar cover. Use already disturbed land for solar. So
And
if you go on their
that's-
website, you can.
Yeah,
find
and that's
more.
not always easy. I remember when we put solar over our old landfill. There was a resident at the public meeting who said birds would fly over and get blinded and fall. I'm sure she believed that, but it's just but that's not true. So you gotta engage with people, but I would, encourage us to think about that.
You talked a lot about the big dams. Have you also been mapping the small dams, small blockages on the tributaries coming into rivers?
Where
We have a
possible.
few in this town, and we've always debated whether we should remove them or leave them. We've opted to leave them so
Yeah.
far.
Yeah, it's tough. There are a lot of them.
Yeah.
There are a lot, and we've got, you saw the size of our staff. So we're doing these things as we're able, and particularly when even the small ones can be quite a bit of work, because people can get really attached to them. So let's just say if there was a group here that really wanted to work on this, then we would be happy to support that. We're doing what we can with the resources we have at this time.
Permitting climate around dam removal must be extremely complex. I would think.
That's not the hardest thing. The hardest thing is
Okay.
right here. The public, and I speak as a 10-year elected official, the public has extraordinary power when you want something or when you don't want something. And that's really what happened in Watertown, is that DCR was like, nope, we're not going to touch that dam. And we started meeting with the local green groups, the city council, the state representatives, the Concom, the Historic Commission, abutters, really anyone who would talk to us, webinars, site walks, herring festival, etc. And basically we surrounded DCR. We got so much support, and it took 2 years, maybe 2.5 years. Our staffer, Robert Kearns, who's now working at the state, I joke that Watertown was his home away from home. But when you have the public support, then we just sit back, watch, eat our popcorn, watch it all. DCR is not going to fight with the town of Watertown. If everyone there wants it, or enough people want it, that's what's going to happen. And you saw the votes in Natick. There are people, you saw the Save Our Dam signs, but the vast majority of people in Natick supported removal. And that's why the select board voted, not to at all disparage elected officials at any level. But there's a quote that I love: when the people lead, the leaders will follow, attributed to Gandhi. I don't know if anything is ever attributed to anyone accurately, but I love it. When the people lead, the leaders will follow. And I absolutely believe that.
You just have to lead people to lead the leaders. Right?
Exactly. That's why we do this work, because especially, we're so blessed to be in Massachusetts, where people believe in science. They're very educated. They care about the environment. No one asked me about politics, but if you had, I would say, when you look at polling, climate action polls well, nothing polls higher than clean water. Everyone, I think it's like 95%, and I'm dying to talk to those 5%. You're against clean water? I think they must have misread it. So we know that clean water is of vital importance, regardless of political persuasion. And that's why I'm so confident that this work is going to continue to be successful, as long as we can have people know about it and understand what needs to be done.
Why are the heavy water storms called 100-year storms?
I know, it's a terrible terminology. It means 1 in 100 chance of happening over the course of a year. Right. So August 2023, when the Newton Library was flooded out, all 100 cars in the parking lot were totaled, even though people were in the library. That's how fast the water came. That same day, there was a 1,000-year storm in Needham, in a section of Needham. So when you see how often there are 500-year, 1,000-year storms, that's a reminder that these, we have not updated our storm terminology. So a 2-year storm, 50% chance of happening. But yeah, Ideally, you very rarely see a 100-year storm.
Emily, thank you so much.
My pleasure.